So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the dangers of a single story. The example I wanted to bring up that I experienced in my own personal life was I work in a school that has a lot of different, um, a very, well, pretty much for the most part, probably 70–80% of the students come from low socioeconomic status. And it pulls from one specific area that's known to be extremely low. Most of the parents that come from that area, a lot of them don't have high school diplomas themselves. A lot of them um, have had trouble with the law. So these are the families that these kids are coming from, and and most of the other staff know that. And so one issue we had at the school was a lot of people would pretty much treat these kids like they were different, or just assume that they were going to be bad kids, and they weren't treated fairly because they would do certain things where they get in trouble in class or whatever, and the punishment would be much harsher on these kids because of where they came from. And this was rampant throughout the whole school. Pretty much, if you knew a kid was from this specific neighborhood, and the neighborhood had a specific name and everybody knew it, um, they were treated a certain way. Um, and one thing that I always try to do with all of my students, um, especially as an assistant principal, is treat them all the same. Instead of looking at, you know, where they're from or anything like that, I try to look at more at what they did and how, maybe what their background is a little bit, but how you can get them from where they're at now into a better place. And so it was a few. I honestly, I didn't even know that I had an effect on these kids' lives until a couple years later. They had a conversation with somebody else in the school, and they stated that they felt like and I was doing the discipline at the time, so they had a little more contact with me, is that I was the only one that had treated them as if they um, were a normal student. They felt like most of the teachers and other administrators treated them differently because of where they were from, and that they got harsher punishments because of that, which, looking at the data, was probably true. Um, but I never really thought about it that way when I was the assistant principal there. And so it was kind of nice to hear them tell that story, and then it was relayed back to me. So it made me feel like, that I kind of made a little bit of a difference in these kids' lives. But I realized then that there was that. I saw the same thing, the danger of a single story there, where most people at the school looked at these kids like they were just kids from this really bad neighborhood where there was no education at all. Most kids were high school dropouts that were in that neighborhood, and so they're all kind of treated that way. And so that was their single story about these kids. And some of them were actually really good kids, but because of where they were from, they were treated a certain way. And I noticed that if you were treated a certain way over time, you started to act that way. And so it wasn't something that I consciously thought of at the time that these kids were being mistreated, but I just approached it with the idea that everybody should be treated the same. And and then after that experience, and that was a very recent experience I had, where that story is relayed back to me, that that most people at the school had a single story about the kids from this neighborhood, and it was dangerous because I'm sure that there were kids that have fallen through the cracks and maybe didn't achieve what they could have achieved because there was no support there because of the neighborhood they were from, because everyone had a single story about them and didn't realize who they were, that they were human beings too, and that they had the same potential as anybody else. Maybe they just had a different background and different obstacles they had to overcome, but they still needed the same support as everyone else, which they generally didn't get. So, I think that there's a lot of danger in the single story, and that regardless of where people are coming from, they need to be treated like human beings, and they need to be treated equally and given the same opportunities. And if they have the same opportunities, you can't ask for much else. So there you go. There's my story of my video on a single story.